More often than not when doing these videos and going through some of the horror movie sequels, I get that classic comment. There were sequels? So today I figured we'd check out 10 sequels that I feel are a little less known, movies that get a blank look from people whenever I bring them up, and sequels that probably shouldn't have even existed in the first place. So let's check them out to see if they're any good, have any connections, and if any of the original cast members wanted anything to do with it. Number 10. 2 years after American Psycho killed audiences, I guess someone thought that there should be a sequel, so they took a completely unrelated script and altered it to become a sequel. Even though the original film implied that Patrick Bateman may not have actually been a killer, and the murders in the film were all simply in his head, this one concludes that he was indeed real. He attacks little Rachel's babysitter, but she gets loose and stops him and says that he becomes famous and they wrote a book about him. So I guess it could be inferred that the book and movie of American Psycho are simply fictional and this is based in our world. Anyway, Rachel grows up to be Jackie and is going to college studying under the creator of Tech War. She starts to kill people, and I mean, she kills everyone. Like somehow she's able to drive a whole broom through a guy's head, and it turns out that Rachel isn't even Rachel, and she drives off of a cliff. It cuts to 2 years later, and she's faked her death and reveals to her psychiatrist that she's stolen another identity, and I guess he doesn't tell someone? I mean, it would be pretty easy to find out. This is a terrible follow-up, and the fact that it was originally unrelated is pretty obvious. The connection to Bateman is minor and doesn't matter to the plot in any relevant way. And sorry to say, Mila Kunis is no Christian Bale. If you based it on this movie, she's not even Christian Slater. So breaking it down, is there any integral new information in this one? Very little. Just the information that Bateman was a real killer and was caught. Were there any original cast members? None at all. Number 9. Hey, speaking of Christian Slater, he's no Kevin Bacon, but that didn't stop him from being in The Hollow Man 2, though. Coming out 6 years after the original Paul Verhoeven film, this straight-to-DVD release starts with a man being attacked by an invisible assailant who sounds suspiciously like a pirate radio station DJ. Police protect Maggie here, who apparently has something that Invisible, but like in Mr. Robot Invisible, is after. He stalks her, and these people are able to see him with night vision, which isn't how night vision works. It's not like it's an infrared or something. It just boosts the light in the room. It wouldn't make something invisible visible. And then it's clear that the military is after him as well, and if you were hoping for the high concept sci-fi of the original, well, would you settle for no? Invisi-Guy gets hit by a car hard enough to do this and sprays blood everywhere, and then he's just covered in blood, but is able to just walk away, so I guess the serum does more than just make you see through. They referenced the last movie, saying it was 5 years ago, and 1 year later they tried to reproduce the original film's experiments with Michael Griffin. And with a name like Griffin, he was just bound to be invisible. Flashbacks show Slater, like the one day that he had to show up on set, I guess, and after a bunch of chases, there's a face-off in a mall where mall security guards have guns. Mall cops have guns, like with bullets. Turner uses the formula to go invisible, and he and Griffin have a naked invisi-fight in the rain, and let me tell you, there is nothing more exciting than watching two kinda water shapes fighting it out. Take a look at this. So is there any integral new information? Not really. It's basically a new story with a casual mention of the previous one. Original cast members appearing? Again, none. Number 8. I have an odd relationship with Donnie Darko because as much as I think it's a small masterpiece, listening to the director's explanation of what the film is really about kind of ruins it for me. Spoiler, the explanation is dumb. Regardless, I have no such complications with its mostly unknown sequel, 2009's Darko, coming 8 years after the original. It kicks off with a recap that says it's now 7 years later in 1995, and Donnie's little sister Samantha has run away. She's still played by Samara and is the only returning cast member from the original, and is on a road trip with her best friend when they break down in a small town and get stuck there. A meteor crashes down, and Elizabeth Berkley pops in, and everyone thinks Justin here is weird because he wears this face cover everywhere. But hey, at least he can get into a Target now, and he's convinced the world is going to end. Meanwhile, Corey here is awful and annoying to basically everyone around her, to the point that you wonder how these two girls are even friends. And damn, when they cast this dude, did they just put it up in the ad and say, must look as much like Jake Gyllenhaal as possible? There are some connections to the first one, like the abyss things, and Justin builds a bunny mask, which doesn't make any sense in the context of the film, except to say, hey, remember this? Darko gets run over, but Corey uses time travel to save her and dies instead. And Sam has a flashback to Sparkle Motion, which I'm starting to doubt her commitment to. So there's clearly some attempts to connect to the first one. DD creator Richard Kelly had zero input to the sequel and distanced himself from it, and actually hates when people ask him about it. It was dumped onto video fairly quietly and wasn't even billed as a sequel, and instead called a Donnie Darko tale, whatever that means. So, is there any new info? Sorta. I mean, it fleshes out the time travel stuff a little bit, and it obviously gives a little more detail about what happened to Donnie's family in the aftermath. Original cast members appearing, well, there actually is in this one with Davei Chase, but she's it, the only actress and the only character. Number 7. So The Hitcher from 1986 had a remake in 2007, but it also had a sequel just 4 years earlier with The Hitcher 2, I've Been Waiting. C. Thomas Howell returns as Jim from the original, and he's a cop now, dating Kari Wuhrer because she has to be in practically every 2000s era direct-to-DVD movie, and he contacts Captain Estridge from the first one, although he's been recast. Jim and Maggie go on a getaway ride across Texas, and although Jim protests, they pick up a hitchhiker who looks like Johnny Bartlett. Jim kicks him out, but he chases them and starts killing, and while recapping the first film, Jim says that it was 15 years ago, and he says this is the same guy, but just doesn't look the same. The Hitcher kills Jim, and then just kind of follows the pattern of the first film, with the Hitcher killing people and Maggie getting the blame for it. They face off in a plane versus truck chicken game, and she ends up doing the wishbone trick from the original and then blowing up the truck, which digitally blows the Hitcher apart. His pixels just go flying. And that's it. If you're wondering why the Hitcher is back and looks different, or why he waited 15 years, or why he's doing what he's doing, well, tough, mister. Or Mrs. It was poorly received, and even Howell said that it was a real mess and that he only signed up because he was led to believe that Rutger Hauer would also be returning. And it's not that great, but you know what? It's better than the remake, that's for sure. Is there any new info? Sorta. You don't find anything else out about the Hitcher or anything, but you do get more info on Jim and his life after the first one. Returning cast, yeah, just see Thomas Howell as Jim, no one else, and he's only in part of the film. Number 6. The careers of John McNaughton and Michael Rooker were launched by Henry, Portrait of a Serial Killer, back in 1986. But don't count out Chuck Perrello and Neil Giuntoli, the director and star of 1996's Henry Part 2, continuing the adventures of Henry Lee Lucas. He's still doing his dirty deeds, and this film actually did begin with John McNaughton, the director of the original film. It seems he had an independent production company, and Perella was one of the employees there, and then after working with them for a few years, they asked him to take a crack at a Henry sequel. They apparently liked it so much that they let him direct the film as well, his debut. Michael Rooker, Henry in the first film, was asked back to reprise his role, but passed because he was too busy being awesome. So instead, June Tully stepped in, a character actor who's most known for being Eddie Caputo in the original Child's Play. It takes place 10 years after the original, and Henry's now a homeless drifter, and although the first film was loosely based on actual events in the life of killer Henry Lee Lucas, this one is mostly fictional, although there's tinges of truth in there. He ends up teaming up with yet another creepy guy, and it's actually a pretty similar setup as the first one, and he says that he almost killed himself after the first movie's events, claiming that someone else killed Becky at the end, but was never caught, bridging that one into this. I should note that the original Henry had a tiny budget of $110,000. There's no mention anywhere of exactly how much this one cost, but one would guess that it would be higher. There's really no actual names, or at least at the time, since Kate Walsh here would go on to much bigger fame on a series of TV shows, including Grey's Anatomy, and surprisingly, it's okay. It's not nearly as compelling as the first one, but it does a good job maintaining its grittiness and overall filthiness. Like after viewing, you want to take a shower, just like the first one. So, success there. But without Rooker and towels, the performances just aren't as gripping, and it's missing something. And if this existed on its own, it's a serviceable, dirty little thriller. But as a sequel to Henry, it's less a portrait and more of a caricature. So is there any new info? Just a little? It is actually linked, but only by like a minute or so of dialogue. It can be viewed totally on its own, and nothing really drastic happens to the character in it. It's basically just Henry doing more awful stuff. Any original cast members? Not a one. The only recurring character is Henry, and he's been recast. Number 5. Stir of Echoes 2 is really weird because the first film didn't even really have an impact. It was a Kevin Bacon film that had the bad luck of opening in 1999, right after The Sixth Sense and the Blair Witch Project, and just wasn't as innovative or interesting as either of those, although it was a decent film and turned a profit, but compared to those others, it was barely a blip on the radar. So, it was really weird that 8 years later, in 2007, they decided to put out Stir of Echoes, The Homecoming. This one has Chris Traeger in Iraq, whose unit accidentally kills an innocent family and is then attacked. Recovering, he starts to hallucinate, and the first thing they do is have a surprise party. To be clear, they have a surprise party for a veteran from Iraq who just came out of a coma from a surprise attack that killed several of his team. Sounds like a very good idea. After a series of encounters with mysterious spirits, he ends up meeting with Jake Witzke, the son from the first film. And I know this isn't a timeline, but I guess it should be because he's an adult now and has gouged out his own eyes to stop seeing ghosts, and he tells Ted to find out what the ghosts want and help them. And I'm sure that doesn't all line up, so I guess I'll have to do a mini timeline at some point to figure all that out or something. The movie premiered on the Sci-Fi Channel, of course, and was originally titled The Dead Speak, and then changed to Stir of Echoes, The Dead Speak, and then to Stir of Echoes, Homecoming, which actually makes me think that it's likely that this began as an unconnected script that had minor details changed in order to be a sequel. Like they were already going to make this film and figured if they connected it to an existing IP, even a not extremely known one, it would boost its profile. And for the most part, it's pretty standard and unremarkable stuff, but it does take a pretty wild turn in the last act that I thought was pretty bold. Any new info? No, it's basically just the concept of the first movie with another character. The only link is the character of Jake, who's only in a handful of scenes, but it's otherwise a completely unrelated film. Is there any returning casts? Nope, there's one returning character, but it's a new actor, and he's like 15 to 20 years older. Number 4. Back in 1968, Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby made a really big mark with its take on motherhood and Satanism, was critically acclaimed, won tons of awards, and is considered one of the greatest horror films of all times. 1976's TV movie, Look What's Happened to Rosemary's Baby, is, none of that. This one's directed by Sam Osteen, who is mostly known as an editor and is in fact nominated for 3 Oscars for editing, and begins with Rosemary running away with her now 8-year-old Adrian, and she's now calling him Andrew. She's been recast as this girl who loves to rock and roll, and in fact a hot dog makes her lose control, and the cult is still trying to get the child back. Guy is now a much more famous movie star under the cult's sway, and this one actually premiered on TV on the ABC Friday Night Movie, but was not a success and was quickly forgotten. So, of course, the kid's got devil powers and kills a bunch of other kids, and then ends up split from his mom and taken away by freaking Ginger. And this movie's split into multiple sections, as the first half hour or so is the Book of Rosemary, and the middle portion is the Book of Adrian, and it jumps about 20 years or so later, and he's now become Stephen McHattie, who has been in so many things, but there's no way I'm not thinking of him as the DJ in Pontypool, and he starts to feel the pull as they assemble in order to have him manifest his powers, and things get pretty wild when they hold the ritual while miming up Adrian. Like what the hell is even happening here? And he leaves to go front this disco band, and he does this while under the trance. I mean, I've been with this film for an hour and it's kind of unimpressive, but right now I'm amazed at how committed to this insanity the film has gotten. It's like Exorcist 2 level 70s wackiness, including my new favorite electrocution scene of all time. Just watch this. So the last third is the Book of Andrew, which slows things back down again, and it's not hard to see why this one has been forgotten, because with the exceptions of a few insane moments, it's a bit of a drag. But is there any essential new information? Yes, this is a full-on continuation that advances the storyline pretty definitively. Even though Rosemary plays a very small role, the further explanation of what happens to Rosemary's Baby is here. I mean, they promised it in the title, so they had to, right? You find out the final fate of Guy as well. And is there any returning cast? And yeah, there's one. It's Ruth Gordon. She reprises her role as Minnie here, still co-running the cult. And real quick, I should also point out that there's another little-known sequel to Rosemary's Baby, but it's unofficial since it's the segment of the anthology film Double X, but it's sort of a spiritual successor and not an actual sequel. Number 3. I feel like this might be one of the slightly more well-known ones here, but it's still pretty under the radar. But there was a Birds 2. Yes, Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds is one of his most well-known films, with some truly memorable scenes, but the sequel, well, didn't quite have memorable scenes or a memorable anything. It was a TV movie premiering on Showtime in 1994, 31 years after the original, and starts with a family moving to an island because, of course, moving is the greatest terror. Moving and birds. There's not gulls everywhere, so you wonder if it's actually a sequel, since the original film ended with the birds basically taking over the world or something. And the mom is Tila, and there's a local woman who looks a bit familiar. This one was directed by a guy named Alan Smithee, and if you don't know who that is, it's because he doesn't exist. You see, in Hollywood, occasionally a director will become unhappy with the finished product. And if so, he can make a request to the Directors Union to remove his name from the film. in order to do so, it has to be a case where the film was altered or interfered with. You can't just make a terrible flick and then just be like, oh, I don't like this movie that I made, so I want my name off of it. It has to be something like the producers editing it into a form different than they'd imagined, or some heavy interference during the filming process. And the actual director here is Rick Rosenthal, who also made Halloween 2, but he also made Halloween Resurrection. So yeah. Now, rules dictate that when a director takes the Smithy name, the reasons can't be divulged. But in a lot of cases, those reasons usually find their way out into the public. But in the case of The Birds 2, the movie is so little cared about, no one was even really curious, and the reasons remain a mystery. Side note, the Smithy name was retired in the year 2000. There's a whole sequence where Mom is at her new job and her new boss is just sitting there taking pictures and telling her how attractive she is, and she asks him to stop, but he just keeps on going, and they end up going to lunch together. Soon, dead bodies with their eyes pecked out start to show up, and everyone is really quick to dismiss thoughts that birds did it, which you would think that they wouldn't do if there was a massive series of bird attacks 30 years ago. Helen here also thinks something is up with the birds, and again, you would think that she would be more concerned, although this character is named Helen, and Tippi Hedren's role in the original was named Melanie. So she's presumably a different character, again insinuating that this is a sort of a remake and not sequel. It takes forever for anything bird-related to happen, with a good chunk of the runtime being marital issues and townfolk interaction, and like clockwork, when the birds do start attacking, they refuse to do anything because, wait for it, tourism. Old Carl says that there was a previous attack 25 or 30 years ago in Bodega Bay, so it actually is a sequel. There's more attacks, and it's basically just a total redo of the plot of the first one, just told in a less interesting and more drawn-out manner, and an ending that brings Birdemic to mind. So is there any essential new info? Nope, no new info at all. It's just the same movie again, with a guy saying, oh, hey, remember when this happened once before? That's it. Any returning casts? Just one. Tippi Hedren returns from the original, but is strangely playing an entirely new character, which makes no sense. Why have an old guy character that knows about the previous attack and not just have her reprise Melanie to serve that same purpose? Whatever the reason, Tippi thought it was terrible and described making the film as a horrible experience. Number 2. Man, this is a strange one because it has no right to exist. So there was this movie back in 1995 called Screamers, and it was based on a Philip K. Dick story and featured RoboCop and Elm Street's Taron, and had a screenplay written by Dan freaking O'Bannon. However, the film was pretty forgettable and critically savaged and was a pretty big bomb. It cost $14 million to make, and yet only earned $5.5 million back. $7 million worldwide. No one was looking for a sequel. There was no money in it. Audiences clearly weren't asking for it, but yet, in 2009, 14 years later, I guess someone said, hey, why not? I don't need this money anyway, and made Screamers: The Hunting. We're told that the original film was 13 years ago and that Weller's character committed suicide before getting back to Earth in order to stop the Screamers, and that they've been eradicated. But this group of people go to planet Sirius 6B to check out a distress signal, the planet from the first film. The cast has that guy with half an arm from Saw 5, as well as that lady who was pretty unfairly burnt alive in Saw 7. They reactivate the Screamers, which, by the way, are these little burrowing robot things that make a screaming sound, and Green Arrow shows up, and as revealed at the ending of the last one, there's now models that can take on human form. So there's a touch of the whole, is this person human or not thing going on, but remember when I said that it has no right to exist? It's mostly because they pulled an unsuccessful film out of the mothballs from over a decade ago with the intention of making a franchise out of it, and then not much happens. There's so little that happens in this one, and when things do happen, they're nothing you haven't seen a million times before. Normally, I would say that they had this script and they wanted to make, but then they ended up slapping the Screamer name on it for name recognition. But let's face it, who even remembers the original? Ed Harley does sneak in during the final act for some extra genre cred, and Victoria here is Weller's character's daughter, actually, and Lance is revealed to be the inventor of the Screamers. And yeah, honestly, there's nothing here that you won't find in pretty much any sci-fi movie, and I didn't think that there was a way to be more forgettable than the original, but here you go. Any new info? I mean, what are we considering essential info here? The whole first film wasn't essential anyway. Returning cast, 0. Not even any returning characters, just the relative of one. Number 1. My number 1 here is a sequel that I've mentioned a bunch, and every single person I mention it to says the same thing. Wait, there was a sequel to The Cell? Yep, the original film from 2000 had Jennifer Lopez, Vince Vaughn, and Vincent D'Onofrio, and a visionary director in Tarsem Singh. And the sequel had Tessie Santiago, Chris Bruno, and Frank Whaley, and had a director in Tim Iacofano, director of, well, this, and some TV shows. This one starts off with some visuals similar to that of the first film, and there's a throwaway mention to Catherine Dean, the character Lopez played, and her abilities, but they say there's another, so it's clear that this is just a different character in a probable similar setup. It's Maya here, and she's using her psychic abilities to track a killer, and his MO is that he kidnaps women, strangles them, but then revives them in order to kill them again. It turns out that Maya was a former victim of his who escaped and is now trying to find him, and oh my god, is this movie boring. The whole point of the first one was the crazy visuals. There was barely a plot in that one. It was basically just an excuse to throw a bunch of cool, dreamlike images at you, and if you take those away, it was a pretty standard movie. Well, guess what this one does? Yep, it takes those away. I mean, it gives you a couple of half-hearted attempts at some weird sequences, but they're so few and far between. It's like that they thought that the idea of a psychic tracking a killer was the innovative part of the original, which I hate to tell them, was not. It's probably the most perplexing film on here because not only were they pulling out an almost decade-old property to try and turn into a franchise, which is basically what Screamers did, but this is even more confusing because they took this movie that was basically known for one thing, and I guess just didn't understand that fact and went ahead anyway. Everything about it is so confusing, but also boring. And then, to be more perplexing, it's like they decided to try to make it a little like Saw, and they threw in some of the cheapest, silliest 1990s special effects into the last half hour, except that this was 2009, and I can just not convey how miserable that I was getting through this. Thankfully, no one saw it, no one remembers it, and no one cared enough to try to make it into a trilogy, and the franchise died here. Was there anything essential in it? Not at all. And were there any returning cast members? None.
Welcome to the darkness.
So there you have it. It's 10 movies that are kind of forgotten. I feel like these ones are a little bit lost to time. But yeah, if you've heard about them, if you're familiar with these and you think this is all silly, let me know down below. Or if you know of some other sequels that you feel most people don't know about, shout those out down below as well too. What's the most obscure sequel that you can think about that when you mention it to people that you know, they go, there's no sequel to that movie? Put that in the comments down below. And if you enjoyed this video, please click on that like button. If you want to see more from the channel, hit the subscribe button, and then because it's YouTube, you have to hit that bell so that you get notifications of when there's new videos. If you think about it, please also go to my Patreon page at patreon.com/movietimelines, and you can help support this channel to get more videos made. I'd certainly appreciate that. These guys do that, and they're awesome. And you're also awesome for watching these videos, and I thank you very much for doing it, and I'll see you very shortly for another great one. Thanks a lot, guys. Bye-bye.